In the summer of 1793, one French city made a decision that should have destroyed the career of any young officer sent against it. Toulon was not just another rebellious town. It was France's great naval gate on the Mediterranean, the place where a large part of the Republic's southern fleet was anchored, repaired, supplied, and commanded. When the city turned against Paris and opened its harbour to foreign warships, the crisis was no longer only political. It became military, naval, and strategic at the same time. For the government in Paris, losing Toulon meant more than losing a city. It meant that France's enemies could hold a French fleet inside a French port, use that port as a base, and encourage other rebellious regions to believe that the Republic could be beaten from within. For Britain and Spain, Toulon looked like a rare chance, not merely to support French royalists, but to cripple French power in the Mediterranean without having to win a great battle at sea. And for a 24-year-old artillery captain named Napoleon Bonaparte, Toulon became something even stranger. It was a disaster large enough to expose the weakness of the French army, but precise enough to be solved by one thing he understood better than most officers around him: guns, ground, and the geometry of a harbour. This is why Toulon matters. It did not create Napoleon out of nothing, but it gave him the kind of battlefield where his particular skills suddenly became impossible to ignore. To understand why the Republic reacted so sharply, we have to look at what Toulon actually was. By 1793, Toulon was one of France's most important naval bays. Its harbour was deep, sheltered, and difficult to replace. Ships could be repaired there, supplied there, armed there, and sent back into the Mediterranean from there. A town in revolt was dangerous. A naval arsenal in revolt was something else entirely. The crisis began when royalist forces inside Toulon rejected the authority of Paris. Local Republican officials were seized, and the city looked for outside protection. That protection came from France's enemies. British and Spanish forces entered the harbour, and the French ships anchored there were effectively placed beyond the Republic's control. This changed the meaning of the siege. The French army was not simply trying to punish a rebellious city. It was trying to prevent a permanent strategic loss. If the enemy could keep Toulon, they would have a strong base on the French coast, a political symbol for other rebels, and a direct hold over part of France's Mediterranean fleet. But the same fact also created a weakness for the occupiers. Their strength depended on the harbour. The foreign troops, the royalist defenders, the supplies, and the evacuation route all pointed back to the water. Toulon looked like a fortress on land, but its real lifeline was the fleet inside the port. That was the problem Napoleon would later understand with unusual clarity. The city did not have to be taken street by street at the beginning. First, the harbour had to be made unsafe. The Republic could send men toward Toulon. That was not the hardest part. The harder question was whether those men could be turned into a siege army. The force gathering outside the city had numbers, but it did not yet have the organization a difficult operation required. A siege was not only a matter of courage. It needed engineers, artillery officers, trained gun crews, supply officers, and commanders who understood how land, batteries, forts, roads, and ships all affected one another. That was exactly where the French army was weakest. Many experienced officers had disappeared from the army during the upheavals of the revolution. Some had emigrated. Some were under suspicion. Others had been removed faster than new professionals could replace them. The result was an army that could be politically loyal and still militarily uneven. The commander first responsible for the operation, Jean-François Carteau, had energy and revolutionary credentials, but he was not a seasoned siege commander. His background was not in artillery or engineering. Even worse, his artillery chief, Dommartin, was wounded during the approach to Toulon, leaving the army without the specialist it most needed. This is the opening that made Napoleon visible. He did not arrive as a famous general. He was a young captain, still only 24, and his combat record was limited. But he was an artillery officer by training. In a campaign where the decisive problem was how to force enemy ships out of a protected harbour, that mattered more than rank. Toulon was becoming the kind of battle where technical knowledge could outrun seniority. When Napoleon looked at Toulon, the obvious target was the city. Its walls, forts, and defenders seemed to invite a direct siege. But a direct siege was exactly the slowest and most expensive way to solve the problem. The real centre of gravity was not the town itself. It was the Allied fleet inside the harbour. As long as British and Spanish ships could remain there, Toulon could be supplied, reinforced, and evacuated. The Royalist defenders could believe they were not isolated. The foreign commanders could treat the port as a secure base. Even if the French army gained ground outside the city, the enemy still had a road out by sea. Napoleon's insight was to reverse the problem. Instead of asking how to break into Toulon first, he asked how to make the fleet unable to stay. That meant studying the harbour like a gunner, not like a politician. Where could heavy guns be placed? Which heights overlooked the anchorage? Which forts protected the passage between the outer and inner harbour? Which position, if taken, would turn the enemy's greatest advantage into a trap? The answer pointed toward the western side of the harbour, especially the positions around L'Aiguillette and Balaguer. From there, French batteries could threaten the ships that made the whole occupation possible. If those ships withdrew, the foreign garrison would lose its safest supply line and its escape route. Toulon would still have walls, but the siege would have changed character completely. This was the difference between seeing a fortified city and seeing a system. To many officers, the problem was how to attack Toulon. To Napoleon, the more important question was how to control the space around Toulon. Once the harbour became unsafe, the city would no longer be the same city. A plan can be correct and still fail if it is executed badly. Napoleon's idea depended on speed. The Western Heights had to be taken before the Allies fully understood what the French were trying to do. If the French moved decisively, they could place guns where the fleet could not ignore them. If they hesitated, the enemy would have time to harden the same ground. That is what happened. Carteau accepted the general direction of the plan, but he did not commit the strength Napoleon believed was necessary. The attack that followed was too small for the importance of the objective. French troops moved against the Allied positions, but they were beaten back before they could secure the ground. The failure mattered for more than the casualties. It announced the French intention. Until then, The western side of the harbour was a danger the Allies could still underestimate. After the failed assault, it became the place they had to protect at all costs. British, Spanish, and Allied troops reinforced the area. New earthworks went up. Heavy guns were brought into position. The weak point Napoleon wanted to exploit was turned into a fortified barrier. The most important of these new defences was Fort Mulgrave. Built to cover the approaches toward L'Aiguillette and Balaguier, it stood between Napoleon's guns and the harbour positions he needed. French soldiers gave it a revealing nickname: Little Gibraltar. The name mattered because Gibraltar meant endurance, rock, and guns commanding the sea. It suggested that the enemy had converted a missed French opportunity into something that now looked almost unbreakable. Napoleon had not been proven wrong. The opposite was true. The Allies had just confirmed that he had identified the decisive ground. But because the first blow had failed, that ground would now have to be taken the hard way. After the first failure, Napoleon's task became larger than placing a few guns in useful positions. He had to build an artillery system almost from the ground up. The guns available at the beginning were not enough for the kind of siege he imagined. So he began to search the surrounding region for cannon, ammunition, horses, tools, and men who could serve them. Guns were drawn from nearby towns and military stores. Supplies were demanded from places that wanted to prove their loyalty to the Republic. Retired artillerymen and trained officers were pulled back into service where possible. But equipment alone did not solve the problem. A cannon without a crew was only heavy metal. Many of the men around Toulon had to be taught how to move guns, load them, aim them, and keep firing under pressure. Napoleon's work was therefore not only tactical. It was administrative, technical, and brutally practical. He also understood that batteries had to be placed with purpose. Some positions were built to pressure the Allied ships. Others were meant to answer enemy fire or support the later assault on Fort Mulgrave. The point was not simply to fire more cannon. It was to make every gun part of the same design. This is where Napoleon's energy began to matter. He wrote for supplies, pushed subordinates, argued with superiors, inspected positions, and treated delay as an enemy. The image that emerges is not yet the emperor of later legend, but something more useful for understanding Toulon. A young officer who could turn confusion into a working machine. By the time more experienced commanders began to take his plan seriously, the artillery around Toulon was no longer a scattered collection of pieces. It had become the tool that could make the harbour unsafe, isolate the defenders, and prepare the attack on Little Gibraltar. By late November, the pressure around Toulon was no longer one-sided. The French batteries were multiplying, and the Allied commanders could see that the siege was tightening around the positions that protected the harbour. So the Allies tried to strike first. General Charles O'Hara, the British commander on land, led a sortie against the French batteries near the Western Front. The goal was simple: disrupt the guns before they could become strong enough to decide the siege. If the batteries could be overrun, the French plan might be delayed, perhaps broken. At first, the attack had success. Allied troops pushed into French positions and seized part of the battery line. Guns were threatened or disabled. For a moment, the system Napoleon had been building seemed vulnerable. But the success did not last. Dugommier and Napoleon helped organize a counterattack, and the French drove the attackers back. During the fighting and retreat, O'Hara was wounded and captured. His capture did not end the siege by itself. It did not magically open the road to Toulon, but it revealed something important. The Allies were no longer acting like a force fully in control. They were reacting to French pressure, trying to break the batteries before those batteries broke their hold on the harbour. For Napoleon, the lesson was clear. The enemy understood the danger now, but they had failed to remove it. The French artillery system had survived its test. After the sortie, the siege moved toward its final question. Could the French take Little Gibraltar, place heavy guns where Napoleon wanted them, and make the Allied fleet choose between staying in Toulon and risking destruction? The final assault came against the position that now mattered most. Fort Mulgrave, the strong point the French called Little Gibraltar. For the French, taking it was not just a matter of pride. Mulgrave blocked the road to the harbour positions Napoleon needed. As long as it stood, the guns that could threaten the Allied fleet could not be placed where they mattered. The attack began at night. French columns moved against a position strengthened by earthworks, heavy guns, and troops who understood that this ground protected the fleet behind them. The fighting was confused and close. In darkness, the neat geometry Napoleon had drawn on the map turned into a brutal contest for a few pieces of high ground. Several French attacks struggled against the defences. Then Napoleon became directly involved in the final push. His horse was killed under him, and he was wounded in the thigh by a bayonet. The wound could have removed him from the battle, but the assault kept moving. At last, Fort Mulgrave fell. The result was immediate. Once Little Gibraltar was lost, the nearby positions at L'Aiguillette and Balaguier could no longer be held in the same way. French troops pushed forward, and Napoleon's original design finally became possible. Heavy guns could now be brought into positions that looked down toward the harbour and the ships anchored there. This was the moment when the battle changed from a siege of a city into a threat against a fleet. Admiral Hood did not need to wait for every gun to open fire. The meaning of the new French position was clear enough. If the Allied fleet stayed, it risked being trapped under land batteries. If the fleet left, the soldiers and royalists inside Toulon would lose the foundation of their defence. The harbour had become unsafe. And once that happened, Toulon could no longer be held. Once Hood ordered the evacuation, Toulon collapsed quickly. British and Spanish sailors tried to deny the Republic the full value of the port. Stores were burned. Some ships and hulks were destroyed. Explosions lit the harbour as Allied troops, sailors, and thousands of terrified royalist civilians crowded toward the water. But the destruction was incomplete. The Republic regained Toulon, and with it, a naval base that had seemed close to being lost. The victory did not make France safe forever, and it did not end the wider war. It did something more immediate. It stopped one of the most dangerous internal and naval crises the Republic faced in 1793. The aftermath inside the city was harsh. Many royalists who failed to escape were executed, a reminder that Toulon was also a civil conflict, not only a military operation. Napoleon was not the commander of the whole siege. He did not win it alone. But his plan had identified the decisive ground, his artillery had made the harbour unsafe, and the final result proved the value of that judgment. After Toulon, he was promoted to Brigadier General. That is why this battle became the first clear turning point in his career. A rebellious port did not create Napoleon. It revealed him at the exact moment when France needed someone who could turn crisis into calculation. At Toulon, Napoleon did not yet command an empire. He did not yet redraw the map of Europe. He was still a young officer standing inside a republic that was frightened, violent, and fighting for survival. But something had changed. Before Toulon, Napoleon was one capable artilleryman among many officers trying to survive the revolution. After Toulon, he was a name senior commanders had to remember. He had shown that he could read a battlefield, organize men and guns, and turn a political disaster into a military solution. The port had rebelled against France. Foreign fleets had entered its waters. For a moment, Toulon looked like proof that the Republic might fall apart. Instead, it became the first door in Napoleon's rise. Not because history had chosen him in advance, but because one crisis gave him the exact kind of problem he was built to solve.